I was folding laundry when a pregnant woman rang my doorbell holding my husband's credit card bills. She said I owed her money. I smiled and invited her in. She was holding a manila folder and wearing a maternity dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I know the dress cost that much because I found the receipt 4 days later in a stack of Michael's credit card statements. The ones he didn't know I'd requested, from the cards he didn't know I knew about, charged to an address I recognized because it was the address of the apartment he'd been paying for since March. But that was 4 days later. In the moment, standing in my doorway on a Sunday afternoon in October with a half-folded fitted sheet still in my hands, all I knew was that a pregnant stranger was on my porch, that she had a folder, and that the expression on her face was the specific expression of someone who has been told a story so many times they've stopped questioning whether it's true. She looked at me the way people look at villains. I had 3 seconds where I genuinely didn't know what was happening. Then she said, "You control the money, so you're paying for his baby." And then I knew. I looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way I had learned to look at things in the past year, with the particular steadiness that comes from sitting beside a dying person and understanding that most of what we treat as urgent is not, and I stepped back from the door. "Come in," I said. I had been waiting 6 weeks for someone to make this mistake. I was so glad she'd come on a Sunday. The oven timer was already set. "My name is Catherine Mercer. I'm 41 years old, and I have spent the last 7 years being, in every measurable external sense, a good wife. I want to be precise about that word. Good, not happy, not flourishing, not building the career I'd spent my 30s assembling at Hartwell Communications, where I had been, before I left to become someone's good wife, a senior marketing strategist with a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies, and a reputation for being the person you called when a campaign needed to be saved. Good wife, in my marriage to Michael Mercer, meant something specific. It meant I left Hartwell in 2018 when his mother, Eleanor, was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. Someone needed to manage her care, coordinate her appointments, navigate the insurance system that seemed specifically designed to defeat people in crisis. Michael worked, I managed. That was the agreement, spoken aloud once and then assumed ever after. It meant that when Eleanor's condition progressed faster than expected, I moved into her house for 8 months, slept in her spare room, learned the language of neurology and caregiver schedules and medication interactions that I'd never expected to need. It meant that when my own mother, Ruth, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 18 months later, as though the universe had decided to test me consecutively rather than sparing any recovery time, I repeated the entire process. Hospital chairs, insurance forms, the specific education in grief that only comes from watching someone you love become a smaller and smaller version of themselves. My mother died in September of last year, 14 months ago. Michael was at her funeral. He held my hand at the graveside. He made appropriate noises about loss and strength and family. He had been with Jessica since March, 8 months. The math is not subtle. He started the affair 2 months after my mother's cancer diagnosis. At the point when I was most exhausted, most depleted, most entirely focused on someone else's survival, and therefore least focused on his needs, which is apparently when the need to be told you're wonderful by a 23-year-old becomes most acute. I didn't know any of this at the time. I found out gradually, in the specific piecemeal way of someone who starts noticing small things and follows each thread carefully before pulling. It started 6 weeks before Jessica appeared on my porch, in September, when I found a receipt in the pocket of Michael's dry cleaning. Dinner. Papa's on the River, which is the kind of restaurant where the tables have white cloths and the wine list is 8 pages. $347, including tip. A Tuesday night. He told me he was at a client dinner in Baltimore. The receipt was from Columbus. We live in Columbus. I set it on the kitchen counter. I looked at it for a long time. I felt my chest do something complicated. Not quite hurt, not quite anger, more like the specific sensation of a load-bearing belief beginning to shift under pressure. I told myself it was probably nothing, that he had been in Columbus instead of Baltimore and forgotten to mention it, that there was a reasonable explanation for a $347 restaurant receipt on a Tuesday night in a city where he was supposedly elsewhere. I folded it neatly and put it in the drawer in my desk, where I keep things I'm not ready to throw away, but I'm not sure what to do with. Then I started paying attention, not dramatically, not with private investigators or dramatic confrontations. I paid attention the way I had learned to pay attention during 2 years of caregiving, methodically, without ego, cataloging what I saw without immediately deciding what it meant. What I saw was this. Michael's phone, which had spent 11 years sitting on various surfaces throughout our home in the easy, unconcealed way of someone with nothing to hide, had moved to his pocket, always in his pocket, taken to the bathroom, charged in his office with the door closed. Michael, who had never been particularly interested in our finances beyond the broad strokes, began asking questions. Casual questions, conversational, slipped into ordinary exchanges. What was the balance in the household account? Had I done anything with the investment statements? Was the trust documentation still with the same attorney? Michael's schedule, which I had never tracked because I had never had reason to, began revealing inconsistencies when I looked at it directly. Not frequently, not obviously. But the Baltimore Tuesday was not the only night that didn't quite add up when examined. I didn't confront him. I want to explain why, because I think it's important, and because I've had people ask me since, people who find out the story and can't understand the patience of it. I didn't confront him because I had spent 2 years learning that you don't move until you know what you're moving toward. I had watched doctors wait for the right information before making decisions. I had learned that acting on insufficient data costs more than waiting costs. I was waiting, and I was not idle while I waited. In the third week of September, I called a woman named Diana Rowe. Diana is a family law attorney with 22 years of practice in Franklin County, Ohio. She had been recommended to me by a friend whose divorce I had watched navigate from a comfortable distance 4 years ago and whom I had envied, at the time, for how cleanly it resolved. I had never expected to need her number. I called it on a Tuesday morning while Michael was at work, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. And I told Diana what I knew and what I suspected, and she told me to stop using the word suspected and start using the word documenting. Don't tell him anything, she said. Don't change anything. Don't move money. Don't close accounts. Don't give him any signal that anything has changed. Right now, you need information. I asked her about the trust. Michael's trust fund, established by his grandfather, administered by a firm called Meridian Wealth Partners in Cincinnati, was a topic I had never paid particular attention to because it had never been particularly relevant to my daily life. The trust income was substantial, comfortably so, but Michael managed it separately from our household finances, which were his inheritance from his parents. The house, some investments, a solid but not extravagant cushion. Pull the trust documentation, Diana said. Look for restricted conditions. I found the documentation in Michael's office in a filing cabinet I had the key to because he had given it to me years ago and never thought to take it back. I read 27 pages of legal language over 2 evenings, dictionary open beside me for the terms I didn't know, until I found what Diana had suggested I look for. Morality clause, section 14, subsection C. The trust dissolved any beneficiary claim in the event of documented adultery, children born outside of marriage, or conduct deemed to be in material breach of the grantor's stated values. Grandfather Mercer had been, by all accounts, a traditionalist. I photographed section 14 with my phone. I emailed it to Diana. She called me back within the hour. This is significant, she said, with the careful understatement of a lawyer who is genuinely excited but professionally obligated to be measured about it. Are you ready to start building a file? I told her I had already started. I had been building the file for 6 weeks when the doorbell rang. I want to describe Jessica accurately because I think accuracy matters and because I have noticed that people, hearing this story, want to cast her simply as villain, as fool, as homewrecker with designer nails. And she was more complicated than any of those. And what she was primarily was a 23-year-old woman who had been given a map of a situation that bore no resemblance to the actual terrain. She was young, 8 months pregnant, which meant her body was doing something enormous, and her face, under the practiced confidence, carried the strain of it. The maternity dress was a deep blue, fitted, expensive. Her nails were pink and perfect. She had the posture of someone who had recently been told they were winning. She walked into my living room like she'd earned the right to be there. She dropped the manila folder on my coffee table. Credit card statements fanned across the glass, printed on paper that still smelled faintly of toner. I looked at them without touching them. Michael's name on some, mine on others. Joint cards I had assumed were being used for groceries and gas and the ordinary frictions of a shared life. Prenatal care, she said, tapping one printed nail against the stack. Furniture for the nursery, doctor visits, specialist appointments, the deposit on the apartment. She looked up at me. Almost $30,000. $30,000? On cards with my name on them. She watched my face for the reaction she'd been expecting. Shock, maybe, or collapse. The emotional implosion of a woman whose world is being dismantled in front of her. She had come ready for that version of this scene. I studied the statements. My hands were completely still. He can't support us, she said, because you control every cent. I looked up at her then. And you're certain it's his? Her face went red in a way that suggested the question had landed where I'd intended it. How dare? I dare, I said quietly. Because you're in my home demanding my money, and I think certainty is fair. She reached into the folder and pushed a paternity test across the table. I read it. Set it down. How long? I asked. 8 months. She said it with the particular pride of a woman who had been told that duration meant something, that longevity elevated what it had been built on. 8 months. I ran the calendar in my head, felt the calculations land somewhere below my sternum. 8 months ago, I was in a hospital in Westerville, Ohio, watching my mother's oncologist explain that the treatment wasn't working as well as hoped. 8 months ago, I was sleeping in a recliner chair beside my mother's hospital bed because she was afraid at night and I refused to let her be afraid alone. 8 months ago, Michael had held me in our kitchen and said, "I don't know how you do it," and I had believed he meant it as admiration. He meant it as inconvenience. "Let me guess," I said. My voice was level. "He said I control everything, that he's trapped, that he needs more time, that he would leave, but he said," she cut in, chin up, "that you financially abuse him." I laughed. I want to be specific. It was not a mean laugh, not a performance laugh. It was the genuine, slightly helpless laugh of someone encountering an absurdity so complete that no other response is available. "Oh, honey," I said. "Is that what he told you?" I stood. I walked to my desk by the window, the one where I keep the drawer with the things I'm not ready to throw away, but know exactly what to do with. I pulled out a folder, my folder, assembled over 6 weeks of careful documentation, and I placed our most recent joint tax return on top of her stack. "Point out my income," I said. She leaned in. Her eyes moved across the page, her brow furrowed. "This shows you made nothing." "Correct, because I spent 5 5 years as a caregiver, first for his mother, then for mine. I gave up my career. I haven't drawn a salary since 2018. I let that settle. The house is Michael's inheritance from his parents. The investments are his. The trust fund, which is the majority of his net worth, comes from his grandfather. The only money I have direct access to is the household allowance he transfers to me each month. The word allowance hit her like a physical thing. I watched it land. That's... Her voice had dropped. The confidence was recalibrating. That's not what he said. No, what he told you was that I'm the reason he can't leave, that I control the finances, that he's trapped. I looked at her directly. It's a much better story than the truth, which is that he is a man who wants the comfort of a marriage and the freedom of a relationship with someone who doesn't know the full picture. She flinched. There's something else, I said, that he almost certainly didn't mention. I picked up the page I had photocopied from the trust documentation. His grandfather's trust has a morality clause. Adultery. Children born outside of marriage. Either of those, triggered and documented, and the trustees are required by the terms of the trust to dissolve his claim. I watched her process this. Her hand, which had been resting on her belly in the absent protective way of pregnant women, fell slowly to her side. He never told me that, she said. No, he didn't. How much is the trust? I told her. She sat down. Not gracefully. Sat down the way people sit when their legs have decided for them. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down the street. The ordinary Sunday sound of it was almost disorienting, the world proceeding with complete indifference to what was unraveling in my living room. Does he know you're here? I asked. She shook her head. Very small, suddenly very young. The maternity dress, which had walked in with such confidence, just looked expensive now, and expensive in a way that spoke of someone else's money spending itself on a problem. I have this entire conversation recorded, I said. I'm in Ohio, one-party consent state. I don't need your knowledge or permission to record a conversation I'm part of. Her face went the kind of pale that takes effort to recover from. I'm not going to use it against you, I said. I'm going to use it against him. She stared at me. Get your own lawyer, I said. Not one he recommends. Your own. Save every text he sends, every voicemail, every promise he makes about support, about leaving, about what he's going to do. Every time he cancels, threatens, doesn't show up, doesn't pay. Document everything. She looked at me like I had started speaking a language she hadn't expected. You're helping me? I'm protecting both of us, I said. And your baby, for whatever that's worth coming from me. Jessica looked down at her stomach. When she looked back up, everything the expensive dress had been doing for her composure was gone. She looked 23. She looked like someone who had been handed a story and run with it, and was only now beginning to understand the shape of the ground underneath. I thought you were the villain, she said. It came out barely above a whisper. He needed you to, I said. It kept you from asking the right questions. I walked her to the door. She paused on the porch with the folder pressed against her chest. Michael's credit card bills inside it, his name on the accounts, the physical documentation of a life he'd been building in the spaces I hadn't been looking. What are you going to do? She asked. I smiled. Tonight? I'm making his favorite dinner. Her eyes went wide. And then, I said, I'm going to sit across the table and watch him eat it. I closed the door softly. In the kitchen, the oven timer dinged right on time. Michael came home at 6:47 p.m. I heard his key in the lock, the particular sequence of sounds I had been hearing for 11 years. Key, door, the specific thump of his bag being set down on the entry bench, the pause while he registered the smell of dinner cooking. Something smells good, he called. Chicken piccata, I said from the kitchen. 20 minutes. He came into the kitchen, kissed my cheek, poured himself a glass of wine, asked about my day. Quiet, I said. How about yours? Busy. He leaned against the counter. He looked relaxed, comfortable. The specific relaxation of a man who doesn't know his situation has changed. I watched him and felt something very still at the center of myself. Not forgiveness, not rage. Something colder and clearer than either. The clinical steadiness of someone who has done the work and is now waiting for the process to complete. We ate dinner at the table by the window. Michael talked about work, a client presentation, a deadline, the particular irritation of a colleague who couldn't manage timelines. I asked appropriate questions. I refilled his wine. Across the table from the man who had been with someone else for 8 months of my worst year, who had told a 23-year-old that I was the villain of his story, who had spent $30,000 on another life while I was sleeping in a hospital recliner, I sat and ate chicken piccata and kept my face completely, professionally still. I had learned in 2 years of caregiving that you can feel enormous things without showing them, that the body can contain tremendous amounts of grief, anger, and loss, and still perform the ordinary gestures. Set a table, serve a meal, ask about someone's day. It's not suppression, it's strategy. After dinner, while Michael was loading the dishwasher, I went to my desk and I sent 2 emails. The first was to Diana Rowe, with the recording from the afternoon attached. The second was to Meridian Wealth Partners, the trust administrators, addressed to a partner named James Caldwell, who had spoken with Diana 2 weeks earlier about the morality clause and what would constitute sufficient documentation. The subject line was, documentation per our previous conversation. I attached the recording. I attached the photographs I had taken of Michael's phone bill, which Diana had obtained through our joint accounts records request. 4 months of calls to a Columbus number, the same number, consistent and frequent. I attached the lease agreement Diana had found for an apartment in the short north registered to Michael's LLC, a corporate structure I hadn't known existed until she found it. I attached the credit card statements Jessica had brought to my door, which now had the additional value of being accompanied by an audio recording of the woman they had paid for explaining the situation in her own words. I pressed send. Then I went back to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine and watched Michael put the last dish in the dishwasher and turn around with the easy smile of a man who believes Sunday has ended well. Good dinner, he said. Thank you, I said. Diana Rowe called me the following Tuesday at 9 a.m. She had 22 years of family law practice in Franklin County, which is long enough to have seen many variations of most situations, and I had noticed that she delivered news, all news, good and bad, in the same measured tone, so I had learned to listen for the information rather than the delivery. Meridian responded, she said. They've initiated their internal review process. Given the documentation, they expect to complete it within 30 days. She paused. Their counsel indicated, informally, that the evidence appears sufficient to trigger the clause. The trust, if the clause was triggered, didn't dissolve into vapor. It redirected. Michael's grandfather had been, as I mentioned, a traditionalist, which extended, apparently, to his views on what should happen to family money when a family member behaved in ways that violated the family's values. The trust, in that event, redirected to other named beneficiaries. A charitable foundation the grandfather had established, a cousin in Denver, a small provision to Eleanor's care fund, which was no longer needed, not to Michael, not $1. Diana had also, in the weeks since I'd first called her, built the divorce filing with the careful thoroughness of someone who has done this many times and knows exactly which details matter. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided fairly, which does not mean equally, and which means that documented dissipation of marital assets during the marriage is a factor the court considers. $30,000 on credit cards during an affair, while your wife was caring for a dying parent, that is the definition of dissipation. He's going to be surprised by the filing, Diana said. Yes, I said. Is there anything you want me to tell him when he calls to ask about settlement? I thought about it. Tell him, I said, that I'm open to a fair resolution, but that fair in this case is going to require him to understand exactly what the word means. Michael was served on a Thursday morning at his office by a process server named Marcus who had, according to Diana's paralegal, a completely neutral expression while doing it. He called me 7 times that afternoon. I let them all go to voicemail. The voicemails progressed in the way voicemails progress when someone is discovering the shape of a situation they thought they controlled. The first, confused, requesting a call back. The second, more urgent, something must be a misunderstanding. The third, the beginning of anger, words like blindsided and after everything. The fourth, a pivot to negotiation. Let's talk. We can figure this out. The fifth and sixth, silence, which meant he had reached someone who had told him something he needed time to absorb. The seventh left at 11:42 p.m. Just his voice, very quiet, saying my name. I listened to all 7 the next morning, made notes, and forwarded them to Diana. I want to tell you about a woman named Dr. Priya Shenoy. Dr. Shenoy is a therapist in private practice in Columbus, with a specialty in complex grief and what she calls caregiving identity loss, the specific psychological phenomenon of people who spend years organized entirely around someone else's needs, and then find themselves, when that period ends, without a clear sense of who they are in its absence. I started seeing her in November of last year, 2 months after my mother died, on the recommendation of my mother's hospice coordinator, who had seen, she told me gently, what it did to people when they didn't get help with the transition. I told Dr. Shenoy in our 3rd session that I felt guilty for not feeling worse about my mother's death, that I had cried at the funeral and then stopped, and that the stopping felt like a failure of love. She told me that I had been grieving for 2 years before my mother died, that grief doesn't always arrive at the moment we expect it, and that the body sometimes does its work ahead of schedule when the loss is prolonged and anticipated. She told me something else that I have thought about many times since. She said, "You've spent years in service of other people's needs. That's not a character flaw, but it does mean you've had very little practice identifying and prioritizing your own. Part of what we're going to work on is figuring out who you are when nobody needs anything from you." I had been seeing her for 2 months when I found the dinner receipt. I kept seeing her through everything that followed, through the documentation, the filing, the voicemails, the meetings with Diana, the call from Meridian's counsel. Every Tuesday at 10 a.m., I sat in Dr. Shenoy's office and I processed what I was carrying, and she helped me understand the difference between the things I needed to feel and the things I needed to do. "You seem very controlled," she said to me once, during the weeks when the divorce was in process. "I am," I said. "Is that the same thing as fine?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said, "but I've learned that controlled and fine don't have to be the same thing to both be useful." She wrote something in her notebook. "That," she said, "is the most useful thing you've said in 6 months." The divorce was finalized in March. The settlement negotiation was, Diana told me, unusually efficient, which was her way of describing a process in which one party's leverage collapsed in several directions simultaneously, and the other party's lawyer communicated this to their client in terms clear enough that prolonged fighting became obviously counterproductive. The trust had triggered the morality clause. Meridian made their determination in February and communicated it formally. Michael's beneficial interest was dissolved pending the divorce. The cousin in Denver received a phone call he had not expected. The charitable foundation received a larger allocation than anyone had anticipated. Michael's lawyer sent Diana a letter in early February that Diana read to me over the phone in the specific tone she uses when something is going better than expected. The settlement gave me the house, which was legally marital property regardless of its origins, because 11 years of joint residency and marital contribution changes the calculus in Ohio, along with a structured spousal support arrangement based on the income I had foregone during my years as a caregiver. Diana had retained an expert, a forensic economist named Dr. Leonard Watts, who calculated the market value of my caregiving labor and the career earnings I had sacrificed. The number was larger than I had expected. 5 years of professional caregiving, Dr. Watts had said in his matter-of-fact way, at prevailing rates, plus foregone salary at your prior compensation level, adjusted for career trajectory, comes to approximately $340,000. $340,000. That was what the years had been worth, in numbers, on paper, in the language that courts understand. I signed the settlement documents on a Tuesday in Diana's office above a coffee shop on Broad Street, with the particular sense of completion that comes when a long process finishes exactly where it should. Jessica, I heard through a mutual connection I won't identify, had retained her own attorney, not one Michael recommended. She had documented everything, as I had suggested. The child support proceedings were, by all accounts, proceeding with efficiency, assisted by the documentation she had accumulated, and the recording that I had provided to her lawyer directly, with Diana's blessing, as it pertained to Michael's representations about his financial situation. I sent her a text 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. No name, just my number, which she had from the afternoon she came to my door. It said, "I hope you and the baby are okay." She replied 20 minutes later, "We are. Thank you for what you told me." I didn't understand it then. I do now. I read it twice, set my phone down, made tea. The house is mine now in every sense. Legally, functionally, completely. I have painted 2 rooms, something I had wanted to do for years, but had never prioritized. The living room is a deep, warm green that I chose from a color swatch in 30 seconds and have not regretted once. The guest room is a pale blue. I went back to Hartwell Communications in January, not in my old position, which had been filled years ago, but in a consulting capacity that Diana negotiated as part of what she called establishing your professional re-entry. My old clients remembered me. The one who didn't remember my name remembered my work. That turned out to be sufficient. I see Dr. Shenoy on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Some weeks the sessions are hard. Some weeks they're almost easy. All of them are useful. There is a question I've been asked by the few people I've told about this that I've had to think about carefully before answering. Are you angry? The honest answer is complicated. I am angry at the specific thing Michael did. Not at the affair, not even at the choice to leave, but at the architecture of the deception. The story he told Jessica about me. The particular cruelty of constructing a villain out of the person who had given the most, and then using that construction to justify everything that followed. I am angry at the years of my mother's illness that I processed in the presence of someone who was not present. At the hospital chair beside her bed while Michael was somewhere else, telling someone else that his wife was the problem. I am angry at the 23-year-old in the designer dress who came to my door expecting a villain and found a woman with a folder and a recording and 6 weeks of preparation, but I am not consumed by it. And the reason I am not consumed by it, I think, is the same reason I was able to sit across a dinner table from Michael and eat chicken piccata and watch him refill his wine without my hands shaking. You cannot be destroyed by something you have already prepared for. My grandmother used to say something I didn't understand when I was young. Patience is not waiting. Patience is what you do while you wait. I had done a great deal while I waited. The Sunday Jessica came to my door, I was folding laundry. It was, genuinely, a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The radio was on. The sun was coming through the kitchen window at the angle it comes through in October. I had a cup of tea that was the right temperature. The doorbell rang. A pregnant stranger stood on my porch with my husband's credit card bills. She expected a woman who didn't know what was happening. She found a woman who had known for 6 weeks, had spent 6 weeks preparing, and had left the oven on because she had known that whoever walked through that door first was going to need to see that I was not afraid. I invited her in. I made dinner, I pressed send, and then I waited for the rest of it to resolve. Because that's what you do when you've done the work and built the case and sat in the patient, still center of your own life. You wait. And you let the truth do what the truth does when you give it enough room. It does all the work for you.